Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. So, very nice to be here. So I'll be talking about um, more like more about simulations, full numerical simulations of reionization, and this work has been going on for many years, and a lot of people were involved. So I highlighted people connected to Sussex in the past or current. All right. So one thing I'm not talking about, not going to present what is reionization and all that. You have heard about enough about that already. But one thing that I wanted to highlight, and I often do in these talks, is that reionization has many different scales, and we need to worry at some level about all of them. So on one hand, when we are doing especially radio observations, we are interested in this very large scale, or maybe even larger than that in some cases. So this is roughly 5 by 5 degrees type simulation. And in this case, of course, you can simulate directly the patchiness and so on. So why do we need large scale for 21 centimeters? Of course, first, because that's where the sensitivity is, but also because that's where the patchiness is. The patches are very large, especially towards the end of reionization. So we want to simulate that. However, in this kind of large volume, it's very difficult or sometimes even impossible to see what's actually happening within galaxies in the small scale structure. And on the other hand, these are the small galaxies that actually feed reionization and create it and expand the H2 regions and so on. So in order to see those galaxies properly, you need more like this kind of scales and fully coupled simulations. So this is more like 100 by 100 megaparsec scale. And then finally, if you want to actually see what's happening inside the galaxy, so things like escape fraction or baryon fraction and star formation and so on, you need even smaller volumes, or at least smaller zooms in larger volumes, where you can really zoom into what's happening inside, and then you have this huge resolution down to parsec scales or tens of parsec scales. And that's very hard to do on a large scale. I mean, with zooms to some extent it's possible, but you still get only high resolution in a very small volume. So ideally what we want to do is to combine all these scales, which in the same simulation currently is impossible because it will require dynamic ranges of millions, and that's not quite there yet. However, we can try simulations on different scales, and maybe from these you get some kind of subgrid prescriptions or insight in how the galaxies work, and then you feed it into the larger scale simulations. So that's what we have been trying to do for many years now, and that's why I like to start with this kind of presentation. So I'll mostly be talking actually about smaller scales, so this kind of scales and this kind, and only a little bit about the larger scales in this talk, but that's what our recent work has been. So one of our kind of flagship project recently has been the Cosmic Dome project, which we have been running now for quite a few years. So there have been several iterations from Cosmic Dome 1, then 2, then 3. So the most recent one is Cosmic Dome 3, which was run on Summit in the US. Well, still there is some money for things in the US. We'll see how things evolve, but for the moment, yeah, we completed this simulation. It only took about 10 days, which is deceptively short because it took actually a year to prepare and now several years to actually figure out what we have got. So we're still working on that, but anyway, so this was run on very large number of CPUs, almost 25,000 GPUs, because the radiative transfer runs on GPUs because it's a using them efficiently. And then the resolution is 8,000 over 8,000 cube grid, uniform over the whole volume, 64 over each megaparsec, so about 100 megaparsec, just under. And the resolution is relatively modest, but in the whole volume, so you don't need to do zooms. You don't need to do reduced speed of light for more technically inclined people. Anyway, I can explain more about the simulations, but ultimately, this created an awful lot of data and a lot of information about the early universe. And this complicated plot, which we didn't produce, we just put our points on it because they were ignored before, is showing you what ideally you want to do with simulations. So ideally, and the impossibility of doing it actually, because you want very large number of galaxies, so you have proper statistics and all the different things that could happen with galaxies. But also you want very high mass resolution, which you can only get with zoom simulations. So the zoom simulations are here, very large volume simulations are here, but you want to be here, right? And ideally you want to be moving kind of that way, so you have large volume and large number, which of course is very hard. But we're at least trying and kind of moving that direction. All right, so what have we got from this? Well, first I thought I would start with a nice movie just to see some, I hope it shows up. But anyway, so these are the ionized regions, and you can see some flickering basically because the stars show up and then die because of feedback. But eventually you expand the H2 regions, all the galaxies are highly clustered, of course. You have the full physics here, so hydrodynamics, gravity, radiative transfer, everything is included. You can see the supernovae in these pinkish kind of regions. This is very highly hot gas, so it shows up on the temperature map as pink, while the photoionized gas is bluish. And then, of course, neutral gas is just dark and eventually disappears. And so this simulation was actually run to well after ionization, to redshift 4 or so. So you can also do things for post-ionization if you are interested, and we have done some of that as well. One thing that is important in this kind of simulations, and it's actually relatively hard to do, is to calibrate it properly so it actually fits the observations correctly. So this is, for example, the what you get from Lyman alpha transparency of the IgM. You can get the residual neutral fraction post-ionization and also the ionization kind of tail end. And there are quite a few measurements. It's hard, but some of them are upper limits and so on, but you can actually try to fit. And previous simulations tended to overshoot this, so get too ionized medium after. But this one is actually well calibrated. You can also get, of course, the optical depth from Planck consistently. You can get the photoionization rate around the end of ionization and post-ionization. Again, we used to overshoot it before, but now it's not true anymore. And this is the ionized fraction, so it's slightly different type of measurements using different observables, but again, you can fit it properly. And one thing that comes for free once you calibrate it properly is this mean-free path of ionized photons after ionization and at the end of ionization. So this has been measured. There are quite a few. Of course, it's not direct measurements. You need to infer it. It's a long story, but bottom line is it has been measured at some level. And a lot of simulations have tried to reproduce it with various success or not. But in our case, it worked out quite nicely, and we didn't even try to do this directly. It just came out by the fact that simulations were properly calibrated, and then it just comes out correctly. So that was quite nice to see. Other things that you can see from these simulations are, for example, you can look at the inhomogeneous luminosity, UV luminosity function and how it evolves over time, because that's exactly the sort of thing that you see, used to see with Hubble and now with JWST. So this luminosity function changes quite significantly in both shape and place, obviously, over time. So at redshift 10 is here, and then evolves over time significantly. So at the moment, JWST, I believe, is looking at this end. Of course, this end is very hard to see still. Then if you compare to observations, they tend to have very small volumes and low statistics because it's very small field of view. JWST is helping with that, but still it's hard and it's still relatively small volume, but at least the number of galaxies is a lot larger. And we get a reasonable agreement with all these luminosity functions. Although there is still significant cosmic variance effects, and especially if you do lensing observations. If you compare to various models from earlier, some of them tend to be more successful than others compared to ours. And they quite disagree on low luminosity scale. So it will be interesting to get more observations and try to start discriminating between the models, but that's our prediction here, and that's what various models get. Okay, so moving on to smaller scales and larger at the same time. So that's the magic of zoom. One interesting thing we have been looking at recently is how to simulate baryon dark matter drift velocities. So many people have done this, but they tended to do it on very small scales because that's a lot easier, and it's a very hard problem to simulate in the first place. But what we are interested in is to try to get this simulation with enough resolution, but also in very large volume. And the reason for this is because this baryon dark matter drift velocities fluctuate on 100 megaparsec scale, on very huge scale, as you can see here from this map, which is 400 by 400 over h megaparsecs. But of course, you also, it's mostly affecting very small halos, so you want to resolve mini halos in several hundred megaparsec box, which of course is really hard. And that's why we needed the zoom simulations. But this kind of problem hasn't been solved before, as far as we know. So that's what our goal was in this work. And we created a method which I won't have time to explain in detail, but basically we introduced some kind of bias which accounts for the velocity, relative velocities. And then we introduce this in the initial conditions. So from this kind of initial condition for density, you start getting, well, this kind with the taking into account the relative velocities. And then the actual velocities before and after, again, change as well. That's the velocity in the gas. And that's the relative velocity in an image. And we have been zooming in a kind of average relative velocity region. Of course, some of them have zero relative velocity and some have higher than that. So that's what you get when you introduce this. So you get that there is significant suppression of the power on small scales, which then feeds into suppression of gas in small halos, which then merge and suppress gas in larger halos, and so on. So this is the power spectrum, and this is the bias that we introduced and are using. So when you do that, we compare 3 different cases. So no VBC, so we just completely ignore this effect. Then VBC in the initial conditions, which is kind of what most simulate, well, not most, but some simulations tend to do, which is introduce different power spectra in gas and dark matter, but otherwise don't do it self-consistently in terms of the relative velocities. And then finally, we have our method, which tries to do it self-consistent. And we can see that this method kind of partially accounts for this suppression. So this is the number of halos that you get at different times compared to the average. And then with our method, you get significant suppression, could be up to 50% or 40%. You can also get, well, you do get significant suppression in the baryon fraction in halos. So again, if you don't account for it, you get this kind of, so less than cosmic abundance, but still relatively high. And then you get suppression if you include the baryon drift. And for the number of stars, again, you get massive suppression. So this is without the effect, this is partially included, and that's fully included. Okay, so another project that we have been working on recently, and the paper should finally be done very soon, is with my PhD student Timo Schwan and former PhD student Luke Onaboy and other people as well from. So this is related to introducing the effect of, studying the effect of different types of dark matter on the small scales, and then how this may affect reionization. Because we are, of course, haven't detected dark matter, so we don't know what this might be. And of course, there are different options, and some are having different properties on small scales. And in particular, we're interested in type of dark matter which interacts with radiation in the early universe. So this introduces this kind of suppression of power spectrum on small scales and a kind of oscillations. So on large scales, it's still the same. So all the constraints from large scales and everything that we know and love from lambda CDM, it's perfectly fine. So we are not violating any of that. But on small scales, obviously, it's quite different. So the question is, how does this affect things? And today, maybe in large scale structure, it doesn't do much, but because reionization is mostly driven by small galaxies, that could be much more significant potentially. So this is the change in the power spectrum. So initially, it's quite significant, and then at later times, it's smaller, but again, quite noticeable at small scales. So if you look at the images, CDM has a lot more structure, and this, which we call IDM, interacting dark matter, has a lot of smoothing on small scales, so fewer satellites and so on. This, by the way, is also constrained realization of the local group. So these two big halos are Milky Way and M31, but that's a different topic. But the point is that you get significant effect on the small scales. If you look at the mass function of halos, so this is the CDM version, this is the IDM version. So again, you get significant suppression, particularly below 10 to the 10 or so, which is precisely all the halos that suppress, that get suppressed during that drive reionization, and they get suppressed significantly. So this means that reionization again could be affected. And we are comparing here to, sorry, switch quite yet. We are comparing to this mass function by a former student of mine, actually my first PhD student that we derived some time ago, which is one of the best fit at high redshift mass function. Okay, if you look at the halo growth of the halos, then this also changes significantly. So halos basically grow slower initially, and then much faster later, so they catch up. So that the CDM is this one, and the IDM basically is growing slow initially and then much faster later. So again, if you have, for example, semi-analytical galaxy formation model or some other model like this, which depends on the halo growth, this could be affected significantly in this type of dark matter. So if you look at the clustering of matter and halos, both density and halos are significantly more clustered with interacting dark matter. So this shows the field. and this shows the difference. So you can see that the biggest differences are where you have the biggest peaks. So things are significantly more clustered around the high peaks, and of course, less clustered away from the high peaks. So the correlation function, again, shows the same thing. You get a lot more correlation. So these are a bunch of simulations with CDM, a bunch of with IDM. I don't have time to explain exactly what each one is, but the point is the IDM always shows a lot more clustering on small scales and very similar one on large scales. So how does this affect 21 centimeter? Well, it does affect it. It's not huge effect, but it is noticeable effect. So there are fewer and larger halos. So you get larger H2 regions and you form them later. And this changes the map as well, which imprints on the 21 centimeter. So if you look in a little bit more detail, you see that there is a lot more small scale structure in the CDM than the IDM. They have exactly the same initial conditions, so it's not an accident that the large scale structure is the same. The initial seeds are the same, it's just the power spectrum that's different. And then if you, so these are just the reionization histories. So we have a bunch of different ones, but some are very similar, so we can compare at the same level. So if you look at the 21 centimeter power spectrum, there is significant difference, particularly in the intermediate scales. So there is up to maybe a factor of 50% difference potentially. And also on smaller scales. So on this range, there is significant difference. And then on large scales, the differences are relatively smaller and go the other way generally. And how detectable is this with SKA? Well, potentially it is detectable. I mean, you can see differences even with smoothing with the beam and noise and everything else, but this requires more study, looking at, for example, how you subtract foregrounds and so on. And lastly, in the last few minutes, I'll try to finish on time. I want to mention another topic that we have been working on recently. So that's not directly related to 21 centimeter, but it's an alternative way to constrain realization and to understand what may have been happening, which is constraint realizations of the local group. So basically you have so we are working with this Hestia suite, which is a suite of simulations which are constrained so the initial conditions are set up in such a way that you reproduce exactly the local structure of the universe. So you have the correct galaxy clusters in the right places, the big voids. You have the local group in the correct place with the right speeds and so on, which is quite amazing to see. And then we are interested in simulating the effect of reionization on that and see if we can actually detect it in the local universe, which of course is the best observed region of the universe and the only place where you can actually see dwarf galaxies and so on. So we have done this, and how we do this is basically with zoom simulations and also some uniform grid simulations. So the zoom simulations essentially are zooming on the local group or other regions if we want to. And we have some dark matter only to begin with, just to set up things and to understand that things form correctly, to check that things form correctly. And then we have some hydro and some RHD simulations, both with zoom and also with uniform grid. And the highest resolution is up to something like the cosmic dawn, but in a small region around the local group. So if you look at different realization at different resolutions, the structures are stable. So you can see the Milky Way and M31 in this big filament, but this is just a small detail of the box, of course. And it's stable between 4,000 cube and 16,000 cube resolution. That's effective resolution in the zoom, not in the whole box. So in terms of reionization, you can also run calibration simulations. And so these are uniform grid large in this box, so you can calibrate properly for the efficiencies of the halos and so on. And once you do this, again, we can reproduce the cosmic dawn results. So we have run almost the same resolution as well. So we can do this and run multiple realizations, for example. And that's the full box. Yes, I'm running out of time, I know. And just to show you a couple of things, because I'm out of time, we have been also running PyC2Array code on this simulation, so I'm not have time to explain details, but if you want to use the code, you are welcome to. And next week, if you are here, we'll be showing you how to do that. And we have run a bunch of simulations, which are, again, very well calibrated of the local group. And you get all the satellites in different realization around the Milky Way and M31. And if you compare Zoom simulations with uniform grid with subgrid physics, they are very similar. So you actually can reproduce this, and there is no significant effect from outside the Zoom region, which is makes things easier. And if you follow the revolution of the Milky Way and M31, it's very similar to what was in Hestia. So we were able to reproduce the evolution even with a different code. And that's my conclusions. If you have questions, I'm here. You can ask about the last or any other. Thanks.
Questions for Ilian?